Chapter 1. A gathering at Gossington Hall. The morning sun cast long shadows across the immaculate lawn of Gossington Hall as Mrs. Dolly Bantry fussed over the final arrangements for her garden party. White linen-covered tables dotted the expansive green, each adorned with freshly cut flowers from the estate's gardens. Servants hurried about with trays of sandwiches and pastries, while the village's most prestigious residents began to arrive, dressed in their summer finery. Everything must be perfect, Mrs. Bantry instructed her housekeeper for the third time that hour. Colonel Bantry may find these social affairs tiresome, but they're essential for maintaining one's standing in St. Mary Mead. Among the arriving guests was Miss Jane Marple, a slender elderly lady with snowy white hair and alert blue eyes that missed very little. She wore a modest floral dress and carried a small handbag that contained her ever-present knitting. At 82, she moved with surprising grace, pausing occasionally to admire a particularly fine rose or to exchange pleasantries with fellow villagers. "Miss Marple, how delightful!" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed, hurrying over to greet her. "I was beginning to worry you wouldn't come." "I wouldn't miss your garden party for the world, Dolly," Miss Marple replied with a gentle smile. "Your hydrangeas are particularly magnificent this year." "Oh, you're too kind. Now, you simply must meet our guest of honor. He arrived only yesterday. From London. Quite the celebrity in scientific circles, I'm told." Mrs. Bantry guided Miss Marple through the gathering crowd toward a tall, distinguished-looking man in his 50s. His silver-streaked dark hair was neatly combed, and his expensive suit suggested both wealth and taste. He was engaged in what appeared to be an intense conversation with Colonel Bantry and another gentleman Miss Marple recognized as Dr. Haydock, the local physician. "Professor Edmund Hargrove," Mrs. Bantry announced proudly. "May I present Miss Jane Marple, one of St. Mary Mead's most treasured residents." The professor turned, his stern expression softening into a practiced smile. "Ah, Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry has spoken very highly of you." His voice carried the polished tones of education and privilege. "Professor Hargrove is staying with us while he completes research for his latest book," Mrs. Bantry explained. "He's a renowned archaeologist who's made the most fascinating discoveries about ancient burial sites right here in our little corner of England." "How fascinating," Miss Marple responded, studying the professor with interest. "Our region does have such a rich history." "Indeed," Professor Hargrove replied, though his attention had already drifted to a newcomer approaching their small group, a striking young woman with copper-colored hair and an emerald-green dress that complemented her fair complexion. "Ah, Vivian, there you are," the professor called. "Everyone, this is my research assistant, Miss Vivian Palmer." Miss Palmer smiled politely, though Miss Marple noted that the young woman's green eyes remained cool and assessing. There was something in the way she held herself, a certain tension beneath her composed exterior, that reminded Miss Marple of her grandniece when concealing a secret. "Delighted," Miss Palmer said, her gaze moving from face to face, before settling on Miss Marple with unexpected intensity. "I've heard so much about the charm of English village life. Sometimes too charming for our own good," remarked a deep voice behind them. "We tend to forget that evil can flourish even in paradise." The speaker was a man in his 30s with dark, intense eyes and a mouth that seemed permanently set in a sardonic curve. His well-tailored suit sat awkwardly on his frame, as though he were unaccustomed to such formal attire. "James Porter," Mrs. Bantry said, her voice carrying a hint of disapproval. "I wasn't certain you would attend." "And miss the opportunity to meet the esteemed Professor Hargrove? Impossible." Porter's tone carried an undercurrent that caused Professor Hargrove to stiffen visibly. "Mr. Porter is a journalist," Mrs. Bantry explained to Miss Marple in a low voice. "He writes for one of those sensational London papers." The tension in their small circle was mercifully interrupted by the arrival of the vicar and his wife, followed by Sir William Ludgrove, the local magistrate, and his much younger wife, Lady Penelope. As the party grew livelier, Miss Marple found herself seated at a small table beneath an ancient oak tree, the perfect vantage point from which to observe the assembled guests. She noticed the subtle glances exchanged between Miss Palmer and James Porter when they thought no one was watching. She observed Professor Hargrove's increasing irritation as he was cornered by Lady Penelope, whose animated gestures suggested she was pressing him on some matter. And she saw Colonel Bantry slip away toward the rose garden, followed moments later by Dr. Haydock. "People are so revealing at these gatherings," remarked Mrs. Bantry, joining Miss Marple with a cup of tea. "Rather like characters in a play, wouldn't you say?" Miss Marple was about to respond when a piercing scream cut through the pleasant murmur of conversation. Every head turned toward the rose garden, where Colonel Bantry had emerged, his face ashen. "Someone fetch the police," he called, his voice strained. "And keep everyone away from the gardener's shed. There's been a terrible accident. Or worse." Chapter 2. The village reacts. The elegant garden party dissolved into chaos. Ladies clutched their pearls while gentlemen huddled in whispered consultation. Mrs. Bantry, her face pale but composed, directed the servants to continue serving refreshments, even as her eyes betrayed her distress. "A terrible business," muttered Sir William Ludgrove, pacing near the lemonade table. "Simply terrible." Inspector Slack arrived within 20 minutes, his angular frame and brisk manner instantly commanding attention. Miss Marple had encountered the inspector during previous unfortunate incidents in St. Mary Mead, and she noted that his efficiency remained untempered by tact or patience. "Everyone is to remain on the premises," Slack announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the assembled guests. "My constables will take preliminary statements. Nobody is to approach the gardener's shed or discuss what they may have seen with each other." Miss Marple observed that Dr. Haydock had disappeared, presumably to examine whatever or whoever had been discovered. Colonel Bantry stood apart from the crowd, accepting a glass of brandy from his butler with trembling hands. "What exactly happened, Florence?" Miss Marple asked the vicar's wife, who had stationed herself strategically near the French windows of the house where the police were establishing a temporary headquarters. Florence Dane leaned closer, her voice dropping to a dramatic whisper. "It's Arthur Jenkins, the new gardener's assistant, found with his head bashed in, lying among the terracotta pots. Been dead since early morning, they're saying." She shuddered delicately. Such a quiet young man, too. Not been in the village. More than 3 months. "How dreadful," Miss Marple murmured, her needles continuing their steady rhythm as she processed this information. "Did anyone know much about him?" "That's just it," Florence replied, warming to her subject. "Nobody knew anything about him. Mrs. Benson at the post office said he received no letters, made no telephone calls, kept entirely to himself. Colonel Bantry hired him on Professor Hargrove's recommendation, I believe." Miss Marple's pale blue eyes found the professor across the lawn. He was speaking intently to Miss Palmer, who appeared to be arguing with him in hushed tones. "I heard he was asking questions all over the village," contributed Mrs. Ellsworth, the doctor's sister-in-law, who had joined their small group, "about the old Saxon burial mounds on Sir William's property. Quite persistent, apparently." "I suppose that would be natural, given the professor's research interests," Miss Marple suggested mildly. "Natural? Perhaps," Mrs. Ellsworth sniffed. "But there was something odd about the young man. My nephew, you know Timothy is studying archaeology at Cambridge, said Jenkins asked questions that seemed beyond mere professional curiosity. The Narrated gathering had splintered into small groups, each offering theories with increasing certainty. Miss Marple heard Sir William declaring to Colonel Bantry that it must have been a vagrant passing through, while Lady Penelope insisted to anyone who would listen that the victim had been involved in some unsavory London business. Inspector Slack emerged from the house, his thin lips compressed into an even thinner line. "Miss Palmer," he called. "A word, if you please." The copper-haired young woman disengaged herself from Professor Hargrove with obvious reluctance, and followed the inspector inside. "Well, that's interesting," remarked James Porter, appearing suddenly beside Miss Marple's chair. "Our lovely assistant is the first to be formally questioned." "Indeed?" Miss Marple replied, studying the journalist's face. "You seem to take a particular interest in Miss Palmer." A shadow passed across Porter's features. "Let's just say I recognize ambition when I see it. The professor's work on Saxon burial traditions has attracted significant attention and funding. Some might do anything to be associated with such success." "You appear familiar with archaeological matters, Mr. Porter," Miss Marple observed. "Is that your usual journalistic beat?" Porter laughed without humor. "I follow stories where they lead, Miss Marple, sometimes into very dark places." He glanced toward the gardener's shed, now cordoned off with police tape. "Like many academic fields, archaeology has its share of rivalries, plagiarism, and betrayal. The scholarly world can be quite cutthroat, occasionally, literally." Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion near the house drew their attention. Miss Palmer had emerged from her interview, her face flushed with anger or distress. "Professor," Hargrove moved quickly to intercept her, but she brushed past him and strode toward the garden gate. "Vivian," the professor called, "you cannot leave now." "Watch me," she retorted, loud enough for many to hear. "I warned you this would happen, Edmund. I told you bringing it here was madness." The professor grabbed her arm, his face darkening. "Control yourself," he hissed. "This is hardly the time or place." Inspector Slack appeared on the terrace. "Neither of you is going anywhere," he stated flatly. "Miss Palmer, I strongly advise you to sit down and compose yourself. Professor, I'll speak with you next." As this drama unfolded, Miss Marple noticed Lady Penelope slip quietly away from her husband's side and move toward the rose garden. With remarkable stealth for a woman of her years, Miss Marple rose and followed at a discreet distance. Behind a tall hedge of English boxwood, Lady Penelope removed something from her handbag. A small, soil-stained object that caught the afternoon light. Miss Marple couldn't make out what it was, but she clearly saw the young woman's hands trembling as she wrapped it in her handkerchief and returned it to her purse. "Finding something of interest, Lady Ludgrove?" Miss Marple asked pleasantly, emerging from behind a rhododendron. Lady Penelope started violently. "Miss Marple, you startled me." "Forgive me, my dear. These old feet move more quietly than one might expect. The garden is lovely even in such distressing circumstances, isn't it? Those roses remind me of the ones my nephew Raymond's wife planted at their cottage in Hampshire. Such delicate blooms, yet so resistant to disease and cold." Lady Penelope's composed smile did not reach her eyes. "Yes, quite lovely. If you'll excuse me, I should return to William. He gets terribly anxious when there's unpleasantness." As Lady Ludgrove hurried away, Miss Marple bent down as if to admire a particularly fine rose. Her fingers gently parted the soil beneath the bush, revealing a small depression where something appeared to have been recently removed. "Found something interesting in the roses, have you?" Dr. Haydock's voice asked from behind her. Miss Marple straightened with the unhurried dignity that had become her hallmark. "Nothing in particular, Doctor. just admiring Mrs. Bantry's gardening prowess. "You finished your examination, I take it?" Dr. Haydock's face was grave. "Yes. Poor Jenkins was killed with a single, powerful blow to the back of the head. Some sort of blunt instrument with a distinctive shape. Perhaps a small statue or ornament. The killer knew exactly where to strike." "How terrible," Miss Marple murmured. "Was there anything else unusual about the poor young man?" Dr. Haydock hesitated. "I really shouldn't discuss the details, Miss Marple." "Of course not," she agreed. "Though in my experience, it's often the smallest details that prove most illuminating. Like the time Edith Green's silver thimble went missing. Everyone suspected the new maid, but it turned out to be the vicar's cat. Magpies being so attracted to shiny objects, you know." The doctor smiled despite himself. "Well, there was one odd thing. The victim had calloused fingertips and traces of a particular type of acid on his hands. The kind used in certain specialized laboratory procedures. Not what you'd expect from a gardener's assistant." "How very curious," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "Almost as curious as the fact that he was found in the shed when Colonel Bantry had been headed for the rose garden." Dr. Haydock's eyes widened slightly. "You are as observant as ever, Miss Marple. Now, if you'll excuse me, Inspector Slack is waiting for my report." As the doctor walked away, Miss Marple noticed James Porter watching their conversation with undisguised interest from across the lawn. Their eyes met briefly before he turned away, lighting a cigarette with affected casualness. Miss Marple resumed her seat beneath the oak tree, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as her mind sorted through the afternoon's events. The gardener's assistant, a man with laboratory-stained hands asking unusual questions about ancient burial sites recommended by the professor, found dead not where the colonel had gone but elsewhere. And now Lady Penelope retrieving something from the rose garden soil. "Such a tangled web," she murmured to herself, as Inspector Slack emerged from the house with Professor Hargrove. "And I suspect we've only just begun to unravel it." Chapter 3. Quiet Observations. By early evening, the garden party guests were permitted to leave Gossington Hall, though with instructions not to depart the village. Miss Marple remained at Mrs. Bantry's invitation, providing a steadying presence. "I simply can't believe it, Jane," Mrs. Bantry said as they sat in the drawing room before dinner. "A murder at my garden party. It's like living in one of those dreadful mystery novels." "Very distressing," Miss Marple agreed, her knitting needles moving steadily. "Though the poor young man was killed long before your guests arrived. Small comfort when the body was found on our property. The colonel is devastated. To think he hired Jenkins on the professor's recommendation without knowing anything about him." "The professor recommended him, you say?" Miss Marple asked, though she'd already heard this from Florence Dane. "Yes, about 3 months ago. Said Jenkins had worked at a dig site with him previously." Mrs. Bantry lowered her voice. "Between us, Jane, I had my doubts. The young man was educated, you could tell from his speech, and seemed entirely uninterested in actual gardening. Often disappeared for hours. The colonel said he was surveying the grounds for some project with the professor." Their conversations was interrupted by Professor Hargrove's arrival, looking more composed than earlier. "I must apologize for the disturbance today. I feel somewhat responsible, having recommended poor Jenkins." "You could hardly have foreseen such a thing," Mrs. Bantry offered. "Nevertheless." The professor hesitated. "Jenkins was more than just a gardener's assistant. He was engaged in preliminary soil analysis for my research. Unofficial work, you take? Understand?" "Soil analysis?" Miss Marple inquired innocently. "How fascinating." The professor launched into a technical explanation that revealed little about Jenkins himself or their relationship. At dinner, they learned Miss Palmer had been given a sedative by Dr. Haydock and was resting. Most distressing for a young woman to encounter such violence, Miss Marple commented, though Miss Palmer struck me as rather resilient. Vivian is exceptionally capable, Professor Hargrove agreed, but she was close to Jenkins professionally. They worked together extensively at our last excavation in Northumberland. Colonel Bantry, who had been largely silent, suddenly spoke up. That's not what Jenkins told me, Professor. He said he'd met you only recently, when applying for a research grant. An uncomfortable silence fell. Professor Hargrove took a measured sip of wine before responding. A misunderstanding, I'm sure. Jenkins assisted on several projects. Perhaps he was referring to our most recent formal collaboration. Miss Marple noted the tremor in the professor's hand and how his eyes avoided the colonel's. As she prepared to leave, Inspector Slack arrived and reluctantly asked, Mrs. Bantry mentioned you had a clear view of the garden. Did you observe anyone approaching the gardener's shed before Colonel Bantry's discovery? Miss Marple considered carefully. I noticed several people walking in that direction. Lady Penelope went toward the rose garden. Dr. Haydock and Colonel Bantry walked that way together. Mr. Porter seemed interested in the garden structures. Professor Hargrove stepped away briefly during his conversation with Mrs. Bantry, and Miss Palmer made several trips that might have taken her past the shed. The following morning, Miss Marple's neighbor called over the garden fence. Heard about the murder? They say the victim wasn't really a gardener at all. My nephew works at the Blue Boar Inn, and he says Jenkins took a room there 3 months ago. He was always writing in notebooks and making drawings. Once left some sort of surveying device on his windowsill. Did your nephew mention if Mr. Jenkins received any visitors? That's the peculiar thing. He met people, but never at the inn. My nephew saw him several times with that journalist fellow, Porter, having hushed conversations. And once, very late, with Lady Ludgrove of all people. Dorothy at the post office saw them near the old church, having what looked like an argument. Miss Marple decided a walk into the village was in order. At the vicarage, Florence Dane was arranging flowers. Inspector Slack has requested access to the parish records. Something about checking the history of the Saxon burial mounds. I wonder what connection they could have to poor Mr. Jenkins. The vicar says there's been growing academic interest in them recently. Something about a lost artifact. A Saxon ceremonial dagger with jewels embedded in the hilt. At the post office, Dorothy Trent mentioned, the police are asking if Jenkins received any special deliveries. There was one, about a month ago. A small package from the British Museum. How curious, Miss Marple commented. My sister works as a cleaner at the Blue Boar, and she found the oddest things in his room. Special gloves, chemicals, and a book about historical forgeries. When she mentioned it to Mr. Porter, he seemed very interested. Outside, Miss Marple encountered Miss Palmer, who asked if the professor had discussed Jenkins's work. Only in general terms, Miss Marple replied, though Colonel Bantry seemed to have a different understanding of Mr. Jenkins's relationship with the professor. A flash of alarm crossed Miss Palmer's face. The professor sometimes simplifies relationships for those outside academic circles. Arthur was more colleague than employee. And your own relationship with Mr. Jenkins? Purely professional, Miss Palmer answered too quickly. Near the church, Miss Marple followed the path to the Saxon burial mounds and found James Porter making sketches. Pursuing journalistic research, she inquired. Porter quickly closed his notebook. Let's just say I'm interested in what others find interesting about these mounds, particularly when that interest leads to murder. You believe Mr. Jenkins's death is connected to these mounds? When someone with specialized laboratory skills poses as a gardener's assistant, spends 3 months taking soil samples around ancient burial sites, and then turns up dead? Yes, I'd say there's a connection. You seem to know a great deal about Mr. Jenkins. I make it my business to know things, Porter replied, just as the professor makes it his business to find things, valuable things, not always by ethical means. Are you suggesting Professor Hargrove is involved in something illegal? Porter lowered his voice. The academic world rewards discoveries. Major finds mean funding, prestige. The temptation to enhance one's findings can be overwhelming. And you believe Mr. Jenkins was involved in such enhancement? I believe Jenkins discovered something that made him dangerous to someone. Miss Marple noticed fresh soil disturbances around one mound, subtle, but visible to her gardener's eye. Walking back, she encountered Dr. Haydock in his car. Been for a walk near the mounds, I see. I've just come from Sir William's estate. Found him quite agitated about this Jenkins business. Apparently, there's been talk of reopening archaeological exploration of the mounds. Sir William is firmly against it. I wonder why. Family tradition, he says. The Ludgroves have protected those mounds for generations. Claims his ancestors made some sort of promise. He glanced at his watch. Inspector Slack asked me to tell anyone from yesterday's party that there will be a formal statement this afternoon, 3 o'clock at the police station. As Dr. Haydock drove away, Miss Marple continued her walk, her expression placid, but her mind increasingly troubled. The secret of the silent witness was beginning to take shape, though many pieces of the puzzle remained to be discovered. Chapter 4. The first suspects, at precisely 3 o'clock, Miss Marple joined the small crowd gathering at St. Mary Mead's modest police station. The Bantrys were already present, standing slightly apart from the others. Lady Penelope and Sir William Ludgrove arrived moments later, she looking elegant but tense, he red-faced and clearly irritated. Professor Hargrove and Miss Palmer entered together, their expressions carefully neutral, while James Porter lingered near the doorway, observing everyone with undisguised interest. Inspector Slack emerged from his office, accompanied by Sergeant Lake carrying a notebook. Slack surveyed the assembled villagers with his characteristic impatience. Thank you all for coming. I'll be brief, he began. The victim, Arthur Jenkins, was not who he claimed to be. His real name was Dr. Arthur Jennings, a specialist in archaeological authentication from the British Museum. He was here conducting an unofficial investigation. A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Miss Marple noted the barely perceptible exchange of glances between Professor Hargrove and Miss Palmer. Dr. Jennings was killed by a single blow to the head, delivered from behind with considerable force. The murder weapon was a specialized tool used in archaeological excavations, a small bronze mallet with a distinctive head. This mallet was found buried in the rose garden at Gossington Hall. Colonel Bantry looked stricken. Mrs. Bantry placed a comforting hand on his arm. We have reason to believe Dr. Jennings discovered something of significance shortly before his death. His notebooks are missing, but we found traces of soil matching the composition of the Saxon burial mounds on his clothing and tools. Slack paused. We are treating this as a premeditated murder, likely connected to his investigation. Sir William stepped forward. What exactly was he investigating, Inspector? And by whose authority was he examining the burial mounds? Those are on private property. That remains unclear, Sir William, Slack replied. The British Museum confirms his employment but states he was on leave for personal research. Professor Hargrove, perhaps you could enlighten us, given that you recommended Dr. Jennings for his position at Gossington Hall? All eyes turned to the professor, who cleared his throat. Arthur approached me several months ago with questions about the local Saxon artifacts. He expressed interest in verifying some of the academic claims about the burial mounds. I saw no harm in facilitating his research with an introduction to Colonel Bantry. I had no idea he was conducting an official investigation. Yet you continued to collaborate with him, Slack noted. In a limited capacity, the professor acknowledged. Archaeological courtesy between colleagues. A courtesy that didn't extend to honesty about his identity? James Porter interjected from the back. That's enough, Mr. Porter, Slack warned. You'll all be questioned individually. For now, I'm informing you that no one is to leave the village without police permission. And the burial mounds are strictly off-limits pending forensic examination. Sir William's face darkened. Now see here, Inspector. This is a murder investigation. Sir William, Slack cut him off. Your cooperation is expected, not optional. After the meeting dispersed, Miss Marple found herself walking alongside Dr. Haydock. What do you make of it, Miss Marple? He asked quietly. It seems our gardener was more interested in digging up secrets than planting flowers, she replied. Though I wonder which secrets proved worth killing for. Exactly, the doctor agreed. Archaeological fraud is hardly unusual. Naming rights, grant money, academic prestige, all powerful motivators. But murder? That suggests something more valuable than professional reputation. As they reached the village square, they observed a tense exchange between Sir William and Professor Hargrove near the tea shop. Though too distant to hear their words, the angry gestures were unmistakable. Interesting, murmured Miss Marple. Sir William seems particularly disturbed by the investigation. The Ludgroves have always been peculiar about those mounds, Dr. Haydock replied. Local legend says they contain more than just Saxon remains. Something about a family oath to protect an ancient treasure. How fascinating, Miss Marple said. And yet Professor Hargrove has been permitted to conduct preliminary research there. Only surface surveys, I believe. When he requested permission for excavation last month, Sir William refused. That evening, Miss Marple was surprised by a visitor, Vivian Palmer, looking considerably troubled. I hope I'm not intruding, Miss Marple, the young woman said, accepting a cup of tea. But I need someone impartial to talk to. Of course, my dear. What's troubling you? Miss Palmer hesitated. Arthur, Dr. Jennings, wasn't just a colleague. We were working together on something delicate. A verification project that could have serious implications for several prominent academics. Including Professor Hargrove? Miss Marple inquired gently. I didn't say that, Miss Palmer responded, quickly. But Arthur had developed a new testing method for determining the age and authenticity of metal artifacts. He believed several celebrated Saxon discoveries from this region might not be genuine. That would be quite damaging to whoever had authenticated them originally. Exactly. Arthur wasn't looking to expose anyone specifically. He was more interested in perfecting his methodology. But if his techniques proved certain artifacts were modern replicas rather than authentic Saxon pieces, a sudden knock at the door interrupted them. It was James Porter. Miss Palmer, he said, unsurprised. I thought I might find you here. We need to talk. I have nothing to say to you, Miss Palmer replied coldly. Really? Not even about the soil? Samples Arthur showed you the night before he died? The ones that contained traces of modern casting materials? Porter's expression was triumphant. He called me that night, Vivian. He was going to bring me proof. Miss Palmer paled visibly. Proof of what, exactly? Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but insistent. Porter turned to her. Archaeological fraud on a grand scale, Miss Marple. The renowned Saxon Ludgrove dagger centerpiece of Professor Hargrove's most celebrated paper and the foundation of his reputation, is a fake. And Arthur Jennings could prove it. That's speculation, Miss Palmer protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? Porter challenged. Then why was Arthur killed with the same distinctive type of mallet used to excavate the dagger 5 years ago? A mallet that should have been in Professor Hargrove's personal collection. Miss Marple observed the two of them carefully. If Dr. Jennings had such proof, what happened to it? That, said Porter grimly, is the question worth killing for. After her visitors departed, separately and in obvious mutual distrust, Missy Marple sat by her window, watching the shadows lengthen across her garden. The pieces were beginning to align in her mind. A fraudulent archaeological find, a reputation built on deception, a researcher on the verge of exposing the truth. Yet, something didn't quite fit. Why would Sir William be so protective of the mounds if they contained evidence of fraud? And Lady Penelope's secretive behavior in the rose garden, where the murder weapon was later found, suggested a personal connection that transcended academic dishonesty. As darkness fell, Miss Marple made a decision. Tomorrow she would pay a visit to the vicarage to examine those parish records Inspector Slack had been so interested in. Something told her that the roots of this murder reached much deeper into St. Mary Mead's history than anyone suspected. Chapter 5. A Hidden Clue. The vicarage records room was cool and smelled of old paper and furniture polish. Miss Marple sat at a small table while the vicar, Mr. Clement, brought out several leather-bound volumes. These are the parish records Inspector Slack was interested in, he explained, dating back to the 1800s. He seemed particularly focused on the period around 1856, when the Ludgrove family renovated the east wing of their estate. How very specific, Miss Marple observed. Did the inspector mention why that period was significant? Not directly, though he did ask about any mentions of Saxon artifacts or burial mounds. The vicar hesitated. There's something else that might interest you. While reviewing these records myself, I found several references to a family dispute among the Ludgroves during that time. Apparently, Sir William's great-great-grandfather, Reginald Ludgrove, had a bitter falling out with his younger brother, Edward, over some unspecified discovery on the estate grounds. Miss Marple began carefully turning the yellowed pages. Do the records indicate what became of Edward Ludgrove? He left England shortly after the dispute. Emigrated to America, it seems. The curious thing is that before he left, Edward made a formal statement to the parish clerk, insisting that his brother had taken something that rightfully belonged to history, not to one family's vanity. Rather dramatic language. Miss Marple's eyes lit with interest. Indeed. Most intriguing. As she continued examining the records, Miss Marple found a faded entry describing the renovation work at Ludgrove Hall. A note in the margin caught her attention. R.L. donated $500 to Church Restoration Fund after discovery of Saxon items on estate, a considerable sum for that period. Did Inspector Slack request any other historical information? She asked. Only whether there were records of archaeological surveys conducted around the burial mounds. As it happens, there were two. One in 1856, just before the family dispute, and another in 1923, commissioned by Sir William's father. Both were abruptly terminated at the family's insistence. After leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple decided to walk by the village museum, a small converted cottage housing local artifacts and historical items. As she approached, she was surprised to see Lady Penelope emerging from the building, looking flustered. "Miss Marple!" Lady Penelope exclaimed. I was just making a donation to the museum. Family heirlooms we no longer have room for at the hall." How thoughtful, Miss Marple replied pleasantly. I've always found our little museum quite charming, though perhaps not equipped for items of significant historical value. Lady Penelope's smile tightened. Sometimes the value is more sentimental than historical. She glanced at her watch. If you'll excuse me, I'm already late for tea with Mrs. Bantry. As Lady Penelope hurried away, Miss Marple entered the museum. The elderly curator, Miss Weatherby, greeted her warmly. Did Lady Ludgrove bring in some donations? Miss Marple inquired casually. Not exactly, Miss Weatherby replied, lowering her voice. She came to inquire about authentication processes for Saxon artifacts. Seemed quite concerned about how experts determine an item's age. The curator leaned closer. Between us, she seemed particularly interested in modern methods for detecting forgeries. Quite technical questions, surprising for someone with no background in archaeology. Miss Marple wandered through the small museum until she reached a display case containing local Saxon artifacts, mostly pottery fragments and simple tools. A small card explained that more significant finds from the region were housed in the county museum, including replicas of the famous Ludgrove dagger and ceremonial items, the originals of which remain in the Ludgrove family collection. On her way home, Miss Marple encountered James Porter outside the Blue Boar Inn. Mr. Porter, she acknowledged. I understand Dr. Jennings was staying here before his death. Porter nodded. Room 12, second floor. Police have sealed it. Of course, but not before I had a chance to look around. Indeed. And did you find anything of interest? Nothing conclusive, Porter admitted. But there was a page torn from his notebook stuck behind the dresser. It had a rough sketch of what appeared to be the Ludgrove dagger, with some chemical notations in the margin, and a single word underlined. Confirmed. Confirmed? Miss Marple echoed. Meaning the dagger was authentic, or a confirmed forgery? Porter shrugged. Either way, it suggests he'd reached a conclusion shortly before his death. As evening approached, Miss Marple decided to pay a visit to Gossington Hall. She found Mrs. Bantry alone in the garden, looking troubled. Jane, I'm so glad you've come, Mrs. Bantry said. The most peculiar thing happened this afternoon. Lady Penelope asked if she could see the gardener's shed where poor Dr. Jennings was found. I thought it a morbid request, but she was quite insistent. Did you show her? The colonel did. He said she seemed to be looking for something specific. Kept examining the shelves and workbench, asking if anything had been moved. When the colonel mentioned that Dr. Jennings had a locked metal box he kept on the high shelf, she became quite agitated. A locked box? Miss Marple's interest was piqued. Was it found after his death? That's just it. The police found no such box. The colonel only knew about it because Jennings, had asked permission to keep his personal equipment secure in the shed. As Miss Marple was leaving Gossington Hall, she nearly collided with Professor Hargrove, who was arriving. For dinner? Miss Marple, he acknowledged stiffly. I understand you've been making inquiries about the Saxon burial mounds. Merely satisfying an old woman's curiosity, Professor. Some curiosities are better left unsatisfied, he replied, his tone oddly threatening. History has a way of bringing trouble when disturbed. Dr. Jennings learned that lesson too late. That night, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, she carefully arranged her thoughts. A family dispute in 1856 over a discovery on the Ludgrove estate. A donation to the church immediately after. 2 abruptly terminated archaeological surveys. Lady Penelope's interest in authentication methods and her search of the gardener's shed. The missing metal box. And Professor Hargrove's thinly veiled threat. She was about to turn off her bedside lamp when the telephone rang. It was Dr. Haydock. Miss Marple, I thought you should know. The police have made an arrest. They're charging Colonel Bantry with Dr. Jennings's murder." "Colonel Bantry?" Miss Marple gasped. "But that's absurd." "They found soil from the burial mounds in his car, and trace evidence suggesting the murder weapon had been wrapped in one of his handkerchiefs." Slack seems convinced. As she replaced the receiver, Miss Marple knew with certainty that the police had arrested the wrong person. The real killer remained free, and the silent witness to the crime remained unheard. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Miss Marple arrived at the police station early the next morning, determined to speak with Inspector Slack. She found Mrs. Bantry already there, pale but composed, arguing with the desk sergeant. "Jane, thank goodness!" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. "They won't let me see Arthur. This is absolute madness. The colonel wouldn't hurt a fly, let alone commit murder." Inspector Slack emerged from his office, looking harried. "Miss Marple, I might have known you'd be here. I'm afraid this isn't a good time." "On the contrary, Inspector, I believe it's precisely the right time. You've arrested an innocent man." Slack's expression hardened. "We have physical evidence placing Colonel Bantry at the scene and linking him to the murder weapon." "Evidence that could easily have been planted," Miss Marple replied calmly. "Consider, Inspector, if the colonel were guilty, why would he draw attention to the body? Why not dispose of it elsewhere? And why would he keep the very handkerchief used to wrap the murder weapon? People make mistakes, Miss Marple, even murderers." "True, but the colonel is an intelligent man with military experience. Such obvious errors seem convenient." Despite his visible irritation, Slack hesitated. "You have an alternative theory, I suppose?" "Several possibilities, actually, but I need to confirm certain facts first." Miss Marple's voice remained gentle but insistent. "Has anyone located Dr. Jennings's metal box? The one he kept locked in?" "The gardener's shed." Slack's eyes narrowed. "How do you know about that?" "Village gossip, Inspector. Our specialty at St. Mary Mead." "I understand it hasn't been found yet?" "No," Slack admitted reluctantly. "We've searched the shed, his room at the inn, even Professor Hargrove's quarters at Gossington Hall." "Perhaps because it's no longer in the village," Miss Marple suggested. "Or perhaps it's hidden somewhere no one has thought to look." After leaving the station, with a promise from Slack to consider her concerns, Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry walked toward the village square. "Tell me exactly what happened yesterday," Miss Marple prompted, "before the colonel's arrest." "It was so strange," Mrs. Bantry replied. "After you left, Professor Hargrove asked to use the telephone in the library, said his room's extension wasn't working. Later, I overheard him arguing with someone. When I entered, he quickly ended the call. Shortly after, Sir William arrived, unannounced and quite agitated. The two men shut themselves in the colonel's study for nearly an hour. And after they left, Arthur went to garage the car. He'd driven Sir William home, you see. When he returned, he seemed troubled, said something about soil on the car floor that he didn't recall being there earlier. The police arrived less than 30 minutes later with their warrant. As they reached the village square, they observed an intense conversation between Vivian, Palmer, and James Porter outside the tea shop. Porter noticed them watching and quickly approached. "Mrs. Bantry, Miss Marple, I've just heard about the colonel. It's preposterous." "I quite agree," Miss Marple replied. "Mr. Porter, what can you tell us about the Ludgrove dagger? The artifact Dr. Jennings was investigating?" Porter glanced at Miss Palmer, who had followed him. "It's the centerpiece of Professor Hargrove's reputation, supposedly discovered during a private excavation on Ludgrove land 5 years ago with Sir William's permission. The rarest example of Saxon craftsmanship found in decades. And Dr. Jennings believed it was a forgery, Miss Marple pressed. He had compelling evidence, Miss Palmer interjected. Modern casting techniques disguised with artificial aging. Arthur developed a new chemical test that could detect the difference between genuine ancient metal composition and modern reproductions, which would explain his laboratory acid-stained hands, Miss Marple mused. But why would Professor Hargrove risk his reputation on a forgery? Surely he knew it might eventually be discovered. Because he didn't create it, Miss Palmer said, quietly. He was deceived himself at first. The dagger was discovered under very controlled circumstances. By the time he suspected it might not be authentic, his academic papers about it had already established his reputation and secured his funding. And who orchestrated this deception? Miss Marple asked, though the answer was already forming in her mind. That's what Arthur was trying to determine, Porter replied. The night before he died, he told me he'd found proof, not just of the forgery, but of its creator. He seemed almost excited, said something about the true silent witness, finally. Speaking after all these years, the true silent witness, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. How interesting. That afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to Ludgrove Hall, ostensibly to inquire after Lady Penelope's well-being following the dreadful shock of Colonel Bantry's arrest. The maid showed her into the drawing room, where she found not Lady Penelope, but Sir William, nursing a brandy despite the early hour. Miss Marple, he acknowledged gruffly, my wife is resting. Doctor's orders. Of course, these events have been upsetting for everyone, especially those with connections to ancient history. Sir William's glass paused halfway to his lips. What exactly are you implying? Nothing at all, Sir William. I merely recall your family's long-standing interest in protecting the Saxon burial mounds, a tradition dating back to 1856, I believe, after your ancestor Reginald's dispute with his brother Edward. The color drained from Sir William's face. You've been prying into matters that don't concern you. A murder in our village concerns everyone, Sir William, particularly when an innocent man stands accused. Bantry is hardly innocent, Sir William snapped. He was helping that so-called gardener investigate things best left buried. Like the truth about the Saxon artifacts found on your land? Miss Marple asked gently. Dr. Jennings discovered something, didn't he? Something in those burial mounds that contradicted the story your family has maintained for generations. Sir William rose abruptly. I think you should leave, Miss Marple. Now, of course. But you should know that Dr. Jennings kept records of his findings. Records that will eventually come to light with or without your cooperation. As she was leaving, Miss Marple passed Lady Penelope in the hallway. The younger woman looked startled, then composed herself. Miss Marple, I didn't know you were visiting. Just paying my respects, my dear. Such troubled times. Miss Marple paused. I understand you studied art before your marriage. Restoration and conservation, wasn't it? Lady Penelope's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide her sudden pallor. Ancient history now, if you'll excuse me. Walking back to the village, Miss Marple's mind was racing. The pieces were falling into place. A family secret dating back generations, a fraudulent artifact, a researcher on the verge of exposing the truth, and a missing metal box containing proof. As darkness fell, she knew what she had to do next. Find the silent witness before the killer silenced anyone else. Chapter 7. Another twist. Miss Marple awoke early the following morning to the sound of urgent knocking at her door. She opened it to find Dr. Haydock, his expression grave. There's been another incident, he said without preamble. James Porter, has been attacked. Found unconscious near the burial mounds shortly after dawn. He's at the cottage hospital now." "Is he badly hurt?" Miss Marple asked, reaching for her coat. "Concussion, bruised ribs. He'll recover, but he's lucky to be alive. A farm worker found him while crossing the field to work." At the small hospital, they found Inspector Slack already questioning a groggy Porter, whose head was heavily bandaged. "Mr. Porter," Miss Marple said gently when Slack reluctantly allowed her a few minutes with the journalist, "can you tell us what happened?" Porter winced as he tried to sit up straighter. "Got a telephone call last night, voice disguised, claiming to have Jennings's missing box, said to meet at the burial mounds at dawn. I knew it might be a trap, but—" He shrugged, then grimaced at the pain. "Journalistic instinct. Did you see your attacker?" "No. I was examining the largest mound when someone struck me from behind. Just like Jennings." Porter's eyes suddenly widened. "But I found something before that happened." He lowered his voice. "There's an opening, a small one, on the north side of the largest mound, recently excavated. I managed to reach inside before I was attacked. And," Miss Marple prompted, "felt like a small chamber. My fingers touched something metal. A box, maybe. Could have been Jennings's missing evidence." Miss Marple exchanged glances with Dr. Haydock. Inspector Slack should hear this immediately. But Slack was skeptical. Convenient that he was knocked unconscious before retrieving this alleged box, and more convenient that he can't identify his attacker. "Nevertheless, Inspector," Miss Marple insisted, "the burial mound should be examined without delay." "I've already arranged for forensic officers from the county police," Slack conceded. "They'll arrive this afternoon." "That may be too late," Miss Marple cautioned. "If the attacker knows Mr. Porter discovered the hiding place." Her fears were confirmed later that morning when Slack telephoned her cottage. "The forensic team reports signs of fresh digging at the largest mound," he informed her tersely. "Whatever was there has been removed." "I see," Miss Marple replied. "And Colonel Bantry?" "Still in custody," Slack said, though with less conviction than before. This new attack complicates matters, admittedly. After replacing the receiver, Miss Marple stood by her window, watching a gentle rain begin to fall. The case was reaching its critical point. She could feel it. Someone had killed Dr. Jennings to protect a secret, attacked Porter to maintain that protection, and was now growing desperate as the truth threatened to emerge. Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Miss Palmer, rain dripping from her coat. "I had to come," the young woman said breathlessly. "I've just been to see Porter at the hospital. When he told me about the burial mound, I remembered something Arthur mentioned the day before he died. He said, sometimes the witness isn't a person, but an object that speaks across centuries. I think he found something in that mound, something that proved his theory about the Ludgrove dagger. Something beyond his testing equipment?" Miss Marple asked. "Yes. Arthur believed the dagger was a modern creation designed to look Saxon. But to prove who created it, he needed comparative evidence, the original artifact that the forgery was based on." Miss Marple's eyes lit with understanding. The silent witness. Not Dr. Jennings, but the original artifact itself, hidden away for generations. "Exactly," Miss Palmer confirmed. "Arthur thought the original might still exist, perhaps hidden by the Ludgrove family after they commissioned the forgery." As they spoke, there was another knock at the door. This time it was Mrs. Bantry, looking both worried and indignant. "Jane, have you heard? They've searched our garden again. Dug up half the rose beds. Inspector Slack won't say what they're looking for, but one of the constables mentioned something about a metal box." Miss Marple frowned. The missing evidence. Someone wants the police to find it at Gossington Hall to further incriminate the Colonel. But who would do such a thing? Mrs. Bantry asked. Before Miss Marple could answer, her telephone rang again. It was Florence Dane from the vicarage. Miss Marple, you must come quickly. The strangest thing has happened. We were cleaning the church vault for Easter when one of the old Ludgrove family tombs, the one for Reginald Ludgrove, partially collapsed. There's a hidden compartment behind the memorial stone, and inside, well, you simply must see for yourself. 20 minutes later, Miss Marple, Mrs. Bantry, and Miss Palmer stood in the cool dimness of St. Mary Mead's ancient church. The vicar led them to the Ludgrove family crypt, where several stone slabs had been moved aside, revealing a narrow opening. The masonry must have been weakening for years, the vicar explained, shining a torch into the cavity. When Mrs. Wilkins was dusting the memorial plaques, her cloth caught on a loose stone, and, well, look. In the beam of light, they could see a small alcove behind the stone wall. And there, nestled in velvet so old it was crumbling to dust, lay a tarnished metal dagger with a distinctive hilt set with semi-precious stones. The original Saxon dagger, Miss Palmer breathed. It must be. How curious that it should reveal itself now, after all these years, Miss Marple commented. Almost as if history itself demanded the truth be known. As they contemplated this discovery, the church door burst open. Sir William Ludgrove strode in, his face contorted with fury, followed by Lady Penelope, who looked terrified. "Step away from there immediately," Sir William demanded. "That is private Ludgrove property." "I believe, Sir William," Miss Marple said calmly, "that historical artifacts of this significance belong to the nation, not to any one family." "You don't understand," Lady Penelope interjected, placing a restraining hand on her husband's arm. "William, please. It's over. We have to tell them." "Tell us what, exactly?" asked a new voice. Inspector Slack had entered the church, accompanied by Dr. Haydock, and, surprisingly, Professor Hargrove. Sir William's shoulders slumped in defeat. Lady Penelope looked from her husband to the dagger, and back again, tears forming in her eyes. "Our Turkeith family secret," she said softly. "The one that's cost 2 lives already." Miss Marple watched as the various players in this drama gathered around the ancient tomb. The silent witness had finally been revealed. But would it identify the killer? Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The silence in the ancient church was heavy with tension, as all eyes moved between the tarnished dagger in its crumbling velvet nest, and Lady Penelope's tear-streaked face. "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "we might be more comfortable discussing this matter in the vicarage." Minutes later, they gathered in the vicar's study. The original dagger had been carefully placed on the desk, while its modern counterpart, brought by Professor Hargrove at Inspector Slack's insistence, lay beside it. The resemblance was remarkable, though to Miss Marple's observant eye, the newer piece lacked the subtle imperfections that spoke of genuine Saxon craftsmanship. "I believe," Miss Marple began, "that we are looking at the heart of this case. The original Saxon Ludgrove dagger, hidden away for generations, and its modern reproduction, which has been presented to the world as authentic." Professor Hargrove cleared his throat. "I was not party to any deception. The dagger was presented to me for authentication under circumstances you found convenient not to question too closely," Sir William interrupted bitterly. "Your academic reputation was built on a lie, Professor. But the blood is not on your hands alone." Lady Penelope placed a hand on her husband's arm. "William, please, let me explain." She turned to the others, her composure partially restored. The Ludgrove family has protected a secret since 1856. When Reginald Ludgrove discovered the original dagger during an early excavation of the burial mounds, he recognized its historical significance. But rather than surrender it to a museum, he had a replica made and hid the original in his own tomb, Miss Marple supplied. A clever hiding place. Yes. The family maintained the secret for generations, guarding the burial mounds from further exploration. When William's father died, he inherited both the estate and the responsibility. But you decided to profit from your inheritance, Inspector Slack suggested accusingly. Sir William flushed with anger. It wasn't like that. The estate was crumbling, mortgaged to the hilt. When Professor Hargrove approached me about conducting a survey of the mounds, I saw an opportunity. A controlled discovery of the replica, which had been in our family vault for over a century, would bring attention to our historical lands, perhaps funding for preservation, and academic acclaim for the professor, Miss Palmer added. I had no reason to doubt its authenticity, Professor Hargrove insisted. The provenance seemed impeccable, the discovery circumstances convincing. Until Dr. Jennings began asking uncomfortable questions, Miss Marple observed quietly. Lady Penelope nodded, dabbing at her eyes. Arthur had developed a new testing method. He suspected the dagger might be more recent than claimed. And you knew he was right, Miss Marple said, not as a question, but as a statement. Because of your background in art restoration, you recognize the techniques used to artificially age the replica. A gasp of realization escaped Mrs. Bantry. That's why you were so interested in the gardener's shed, and why you took something from our rose garden. Lady Penelope's face crumpled. I was trying to protect my husband. When I heard about the murder, I realized the small box Arthur had shown me might still be in the shed. It contained his testing equipment and samples from the dagger. And the item you removed from the rose garden? Miss Marple pressed. A soil sample bag. It had fallen from Arthur's pocket during... She stopped, unable to continue. During his murder, Inspector Slack finished flatly. Which brings us to the crucial question. Who killed Dr. Jennings? Miss Marple's gentle eyes moved around the room, studying each face with careful attention. Before we address that question, Inspector, I believe we should consider what Dr. Jennings discovered in the burial mound. The evidence that cost him his life. The original dagger was in the church tomb, not the mound, Sir William objected. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, but Dr. Jennings found something else, something that revealed not just the existence of a forgery, but its creator. She turned to Professor Hargrove. When was the replica actually made, Professor? The professor shifted uncomfortably. According to Sir William, in the 1850s. Yet the metalworking techniques used weren't developed until the early 20th century, Miss Palmer interjected. That's what Arthur's tests revealed. A look of understanding dawned on Dr. Haydock's face. The family secret isn't just that they hid the original, it's that they created a modern forgery and claimed it was a Victorian replica. Precisely, Miss Marple confirmed. And Dr. Jennings found proof of this in the burial mound. Perhaps old excavation tools or early photographs of the original. Something that established when the replica was actually created. And by whom? All eyes turned to Sir William, who had gone very pale. It wasn't William, Lady Penelope said quickly. It was his father, Sebastian Ludgrove. He was an accomplished metalsmith as well as a landowner. When the estate faced financial ruin in the 1920s, he created the replica with the intention of discovering it himself. But he never did, Miss Marple continued the narrative. According to the parish records, He fell ill shortly after the second archaeological survey was abruptly terminated. The replica remained hidden until Sir William decided to use it. "This is all very interesting," Inspector Slack interrupted. "But it doesn't tell us who killed Dr. Jennings or attacked Mr. Porter." "Doesn't it?" Miss Marple said softly. She rose from her chair and moved to stand near the window, the warm afternoon light illuminating her delicate features. "I believe it's time for a test. One that will reveal our murderer beyond any doubt." From her knitting bag, she carefully extracted a small metal box. "Dr. Jennings's missing evidence," she announced. "Found not in the burial mound or the gardener's shed, but in a much simpler hiding place." "Where did you get that?" Inspector Slack demanded. "From beneath the loose floorboard in Dr. Jennings's room at the Blue Boar," Miss Marple replied. "The same hiding place my nephew Raymond always used when staying there as a boy. Village continuity, Inspector. So reliable." She placed the box on the desk beside the two daggers. "Shall we see what secrets it contains?" As Miss Marple's fingers moved toward the latch, there was a sudden flurry of movement. Later, witnesses would disagree about exactly what happened first, whether it was Miss Palmer's cry of "wait" or the heavy paperweight that came crashing down, narrowly missing Miss Marple's hand. What no one disputed was the identity of the person who had thrown it: Professor Edmund Hargrove, his distinguished face now distorted with desperate rage. "You meddling old woman," he snarled, lunging forward. But Inspector Slack was faster, restraining the professor as Dr. Haydock and Sir William moved protectively toward Miss Marple. "I believe," Miss Marple said with remarkable composure, "that we have our answer." Chapter 9. The reveal: once Professor Hargrove had been secured in the adjoining room under the watchful eye of Sergeant Lake, and Dr. Haydock had confirmed that Miss Marple was unharmed despite the professor's outburst, Inspector Slack turned to the elderly woman with newfound respect. "You knew it was Hargrove all along?" he asked. "Not all along," Miss Marple admitted, settling back into her chair. "But certain inconsistencies in his behavior pointed in his direction, particularly after I understood the true nature of the deception regarding the dagger." "But how does the professor's academic fraud lead to murder?" Mrs. Bantry asked. "Surely exposure would damage his reputation, but many have survived worse." Miss Marple's knitting needles emerged from her bag, her hands seeking their familiar rhythm as she organized her thoughts. "This case was never about simple academic fraud, but about something far more serious." She nodded toward the metal box still sitting unopened on the desk. "May I suggest we examine the contents, Inspector? I believe they will explain everything." With methodical care, Slack opened the box. Inside were several small vials of chemicals, a notebook filled with technical notations, and a series of photographs, some of the Ludgrove dagger, others of what appeared to be workshop tools and equipment. "These were taken in a basement workshop," Miss Palmer observed, examining the photographs. "Arthur must have located where the replica was actually created." "Not where," Miss Marple corrected gently. "By whom?" "Those are Professor Hargrove's tools, photographed in his London flat. Do you see the distinctive mark on that hammer? I noticed the same mark on a tool the professor used to tap soil samples during Mrs. Bantry's garden party." Inspector Slack extracted a final item from the bottom of the box, a small velvet pouch. Inside was a fragment of metal, tarnished with age. "A piece of the original dagger," Miss Marple explained. "Dr. Jennings managed to obtain it during his investigation, perhaps from the burial mound, where the original was temporarily hidden before being moved to Reginald Ludgrove's tomb." His chemical analysis would have proven conclusively that the displayed dagger was created using modern techniques. But Professor Hargrove claimed he was deceived about the replica's authenticity. "Sir," William protested, "why would he kill to protect the deception he wasn't responsible for?" "Because," Miss Marple replied, "Professor Hargrove wasn't deceived at all. He created the replica himself." A stunned silence fell over the room. "Impossible," Lady Penelope finally said. "The replica has been in the Ludgrove family since the 1920s. "Has it?" Miss Marple countered. "Or was that simply what you were told? Sir William, did you ever actually see this replica before Professor Hargrove discovered it during his excavation 5 years ago?" Sir William's expression shifted from confusion to dawning realization. "No," he admitted slowly. "My father spoke of it, but he kept it locked away. After his death, I searched the family vault, but never found it. When Hargrove approached me about exploring the mounds, I mentioned the replica's existence, but I never claimed to have it in my possession." "Precisely," Miss Marple nodded. "The professor saw an opportunity. He created a replica based on historical descriptions of the original dagger, then orchestrated its discovery on your land. The perfect arrangement, academic recognition for him, historical prestige, and tourism for your estate. He even suggested continuing the family tradition of keeping the original in private hands rather than surrendering it to a museum. Which is why the replica never underwent rigorous authentication," Miss Palmer added, comprehension dawning. "The professor controlled the entire process." "A scheme that worked perfectly," Miss Marple continued, "until Dr. Jennings developed his new testing method that could definitively expose modern metallurgical techniques. When he began asking questions about the Saxon burial mounds, Professor Hargrove saw an opportunity to place him at Gossington Hall as a gardener's assistant, where he could monitor Jennings's activities while maintaining the pretense of professional courtesy. But Jennings discovered the truth anyway," Inspector Slack concluded. "Yes, I believe he found evidence in the burial mound, perhaps old excavation records or photographs, that proved the Ludgrove family's story about a Victorian replica was genuine, but that the dagger currently attributed to that period was actually a very recent creation. His chemical tests would have confirmed modern manufacturing techniques." Miss Marple turned to Miss Palmer. "When Dr. Jennings showed you his preliminary findings, you inadvertently alerted the professor, didn't you?" Miss Palmer's face flushed with guilt. "I didn't realize. Edmund and I had been colleagues for years. I mentioned that Arthur was excited about a breakthrough regarding dating techniques for metal artifacts. I never imagined—" "Of course not, my dear," Miss Marple assured her kindly. "The professor cultivated a reputation for academic integrity, precisely to mask his willingness to manufacture evidence when it suited his purposes. So he killed Jennings before he could expose the fraud," Dr. Haydock summarized. "Yes," Miss Marple confirmed, "using an archaeological mallet, a fitting weapon given the circumstances. He then hid the body in the gardener's shed, knowing it would eventually be discovered. And he attacked Porter when he came too close to finding Jennings's hidden evidence in the burial mound," Inspector Slack added. "Not quite," Miss Marple corrected. "The professor was in custody being questioned when Mr. Porter was attacked. I believe his accomplice was responsible for that incident." All eyes turned to Miss Marple in surprise. "Accomplice?" Mrs. Bantry exclaimed. "Who?" Miss Marple's gentle gaze settled on Vivian Palmer, whose composed exterior suddenly seemed brittle. "Miss Palmer has been the professor's assistant for how long?" Miss Marple asked. 5 years, Miss Palmer replied, her voice steady despite her growing pallor. "Since the Ludgrove dagger discovery." "And you were present during that excavation, were you not?" perfectly positioned to find the artifact that the professor had created? That's absurd, Miss Palmer protested, though her hands trembled slightly. I was as deceived as everyone else. I think not, Miss Marple said quietly. Your expertise in archaeological conservation would have made you an ideal collaborator in creating a convincing replica. When Dr. Jennings began to suspect the truth, you cultivated his trust, learning what evidence he had gathered while reporting back to Professor Hargrove. You can't prove any of this, Miss Palmer stated, a new hardness entering her voice. Perhaps not directly, Miss Marple acknowledged. But I noticed something curious about your interactions with Dr. Jennings. Despite claiming only a professional relationship, you refer to him as Arthur, with the familiarity of someone quite close. Yet, in your conversations with others, you consistently called him Jennings or Dr. Jennings. A small inconsistency, but revealing. Inspector Slack stepped forward. Miss Palmer, I believe we need to continue this discussion at the station. As Sergeant Lake was summoned to escort Miss Palmer out, she turned to Miss Marple with a mixture of anger and reluctant admiration. You're very clever, Miss Marple, but you've missed one crucial detail. The metal box. How did you really find it? It wasn't in Jennings's room. I searched there myself. Ah, Miss Marple smiled gently. That was my final test. The box is actually empty. Merely a similar one from my own collection. I suspected that whoever reacted most strongly to its appearance would be our murderer. Or, in this case, murderers. After the professor and Miss Palmer had been taken away, and Inspector Slack had departed with the evidence, a subdued group remained in the vicarage study. I still don't understand how you put it all together, Mrs. Bantry said to Miss Marple as they prepared to leave. Human nature remains constant, dear, Miss Marple replied. The professor's scheme reminded me of Eliza Morehouse, who forged her cousin's painting and claimed it was an undiscovered work by the cousin's famous father. Ambition, deception, and the desperate measures people will take to protect their reputations. I've seen it all before, I'm afraid. Sir William approached Miss Marple with evident discomfort. I owe you an apology, Miss Marple, and I suppose I owe one to Colonel Bantry as well. The colonel will be released immediately, Dr. Haydock assured them. Slack may be stubborn, but he's not a fool. As they walked back toward the village, Mrs. Bantry linked her arm through Miss Marple's. There's just one thing I still don't understand, Jane. What did you mean by the silent witness in this case? Miss Marple smiled. The original dagger, of course, hidden away for generations, yet its very existence testified to the truth. Dr. Jennings recognized this when he found evidence of the original in the burial mound. The silent witness had finally spoken after all these years, revealing not only its own authenticity, but the professor's deception. And costing poor Dr. Jennings his life, Mrs. Bantry added soberly. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, but in the end, the silent witness had the final word. As truth so often does, my dear. As truth so often does. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The first signs. 3 days after the arrest of Professor Hargrove and Miss Palmer, life in St. Mary Mead was gradually returning to its usual peaceful rhythm. Colonel Bantry had been released with a formal apology from the IUI police, and Gossington Hall was once again a place of quiet dignity, rather than scandal and suspicion. Miss Marple sat in her garden, enjoying the spring sunshine and the sight of her first roses beginning to bloom. She was expecting visitors for tea. The Bantrys and Dr. Haydock had accepted her invitation to discuss the remarkable events that had so disrupted their community. Mrs. Bantry arrived first, bringing a basket of freshly baked scones. The colonel sends his apologies, she explained. He's meeting with Sir William Ludgrove to discuss arrangements for the original dagger. The British Museum is sending representatives tomorrow. I'm glad to hear it, Miss Marple replied, as they moved inside to prepare the tea. That remarkable artifact belongs in a proper museum, where it can be appreciated by all. Sir William seems to agree now that the truth is out. Rather a weight lifted from the family, I imagine, after all these generations of secrecy. Dr. Haydock arrived shortly afterward, bringing news from the outside world. The academic community is in an uproar, he reported, accepting a cup of tea. Professor Hargrove's publications are being reviewed, and questions have been raised about other discoveries he claimed credit for. Not surprising, Miss Marple observed. Once a person begins fabricating evidence for recognition, it rarely remains an isolated incident. And Miss Palmer has apparently agreed to testify against him, Mrs. Bantry added. Inspector Slack told Arthur she's provided a full confession about their partnership in creating the replica dagger. Poor young woman, Miss Marple sighed. Talented, ambitious, and led astray by a man she respected. Though I cannot excuse her role in Dr. Jennings's death, one can understand how such things happen step by step. Speaking of Dr. Jennings, said Dr. Haydock, his colleagues at the British Museum have requested permission to continue his work on authentication techniques. Apparently, his notes contained significant advances in the field. How appropriate. Miss Marple nodded. His methods will help prevent similar frauds in the future. As they enjoyed their tea, the conversation turned to the finer details of the case that had puzzled them. There's one thing I still don't quite understand, Mrs. Bantry confessed. Why did they hide the murder weapon in our rose garden? Surely, that was unnecessarily risky. On the contrary, Miss Marple explained, it was quite clever. Professor Hargrove knew that once a body was discovered on your property, the grounds would be searched. By planting the weapon in your garden, he created evidence that seemed to implicate someone at Gossington Hall. And when that didn't immediately lead to the colonel's arrest, they planted soil from the burial mounds in his car, Dr. Haydock added. Precisely. Professor Hargrove was creating a narrative. The wealthy landowner who opposed archaeological exploration of his property, fearing it might reveal family secrets. Which was partly true, Mrs. Bantry pointed out. The Ludgroves were hiding something. Yes, but not murder, Miss Marple replied. That's what made it such an effective deception. The best lies always contain elements of truth. A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. It was James Porter, his head still bandaged, but his demeanor considerably improved. I hope I'm not intruding, he said, accepting Miss Marple's invitation to join them. I wanted to thank you properly before I return to London tomorrow. You're looking much better, Mr. Porter, Miss Marple observed, pouring him a cup of tea. Has your experience in our village provided sufficient material for your article? Porter smiled wryly. More than enough, though I doubt my editor will believe half of it. Archaeological fraud leads to murder in sleepy English village. It sounds like fiction. Truth is often more remarkable than invention, Miss Marple replied, though I do hope you'll be kind in your portrayal of St. Mary Mead. We're not accustomed to such excitement. I'll do my best, Porter promised. In fact, I'd like to focus on Dr. Jennings' work and legacy rather than sensationalizing the crime. His authentication techniques could revolutionize the field. A fitting tribute, Dr. Haydock approved. After Porter had gone, Miss Marple returned to her garden to tend to her roses, while her thoughts drifted to the conclusion of the case. Inspector Slack, despite his initial skepticism of her methods, had grudgingly acknowledged her contribution to solving the crime. The evidence against Professor Hargrove and Miss Palmer was overwhelming once their deception had been exposed. Yet as she carefully pruned a wayward stem, Miss Marple found herself troubled by a small detail, something that didn't quite align with her understanding of the case. Lady Penelope's behavior throughout the investigation had suggested a deeper involvement than merely protecting her husband's family legacy. Her art restoration background, her furtive recovery of evidence from the rose garden, her agitation when the Colonel mentioned Dr. Jennings's locked box, these pointed to a personal stake in the outcome. Miss Marple was still pondering this inconsistency when she received an unexpected telephone call from Florence Dane at the vicarage. "Miss Marple, the strangest thing has happened," Florence said, her voice betraying excitement. "While cataloguing items from the Ludgrove tomb for the British Museum, we found a hidden compartment in the base of the memorial, completely separate from where the dagger was concealed. Inside was a journal belonging to Edward Ludgrove, the brother who emigrated to America after quarreling with Reginald." "How fascinating," Miss Marple responded, her interest immediately piqued. "What does it contain?" "That's just it. Most pages have been torn out. But the remaining fragments mention something called the Saxon crown that Edward claimed his brother stole from the burial mound, along with the dagger. According to the journal, it was an artifact of such magnificence that kings would wage war to possess it." Miss Marple's fingers tightened on the telephone receiver. "Is there any indication of what happened to this crown?" "None that we've found so far, but Inspector Slack has reopened the investigation into the burial mounds based on this new information. He's requested permission to conduct a full archaeological survey." After ending the call, Miss Marple returned to her garden, her mind working rapidly. If Edward Ludgrove's journal was authentic, it suggested that the dagger, remarkable as it was, might have been merely a secondary discovery. A Saxon crown of extraordinary value would explain the Ludgrove family's generations-long obsession with protecting the burial mounds. It would also explain why someone had removed whatever Dr. Jennings discovered in the largest mound before the police could examine it. Someone who knew the full extent of the Ludgrove secret and was determined to keep it hidden. As dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple made a decision. The case of the silent witness might not be as fully resolved as everyone believed. Chapter 11. The Hidden Crown. The following morning, Miss Marple arrived at the village square to find it unusually animated. A small crowd had gathered outside the police station, where an official-looking car with county markings was parked. "What's happening?" she asked Dorothy Trent, who was watching the proceedings with undisguised curiosity. "They're reopening the investigation of the burial mounds," Dorothy explained eagerly. "Something about a missing Saxon crown. Sir William is inside now, apparently quite upset about the whole business." Miss Marple made her way to the church, where she found the vicar and Florence Dane examining the fragments of Edward Ludgrove's journal with great care. "Ah, Miss Marple," the vicar greeted her. "I thought you might come. Most extraordinary development, isn't it?" "Most extraordinary," she agreed, studying the brittle pages. "May I?" Florence carefully handed her the journal. "The handwriting matches other documents we have from Edward Ludgrove. There's no question of authenticity." Miss Marple examined the few remaining pages, noting the elegant script and the evident passion with which Edward had recorded his grievances against his brother. One passage particularly caught her attention. "R insists the crown must remain hidden, claiming ancestral duty. But such a treasure belongs to England's history, not one man's pride. He does not understand that in concealing it, he makes himself its prisoner, as surely as if he wore chains." "Prophetic words," Miss Marple murmured. "The Ludgrove family has, indeed, been imprisoned by this secret for generations." "There's something else," Florence added, turning to the final intact page. This entry, dated just before Edward's departure for America. Miss Marple read the faded words. I have left a sign that future generations might know the truth. Should ours descendants ever find the courage to break free from his misguided oath. When the silent witness speaks, the crown's guardian shall be revealed. The silent witness, Miss Marple repeated, her eyes brightening with sudden understanding. Not just the dagger, but something else. Something Edward left as a clue to the crown's location. Their discussion was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, looking even more harried than usual. Miss Marple, he acknowledged curtly. I suppose you've heard about this new development? Yes, Inspector. Most interesting. I take it you're reopening the investigation? Archaeological experts are coming from London tomorrow. Sir William has reluctantly granted permission for a complete survey of the burial mounds. Slack hesitated, then added with evident reluctance, Given your contribution to solving Dr. Jennings's murder, I wondered if you might have any thoughts on this Saxon crown business. Miss Marple considered the question carefully. I believe there may be a connection between Edward Ludgrove's sign and what Dr. Jennings discovered in the burial mound before his death. The evidence that someone removed before your forensic team could examine it. You think Jennings found a clue to the crown's location? It seems possible. His research into the dagger's authenticity would naturally have led him to investigate its historical context, including any associated artifacts mentioned in local records. As they spoke, Dr. Haydock joined them, bringing news from Gossington Hall. Lady Penelope Ludgrove has apparently suffered some kind of collapse. Sir William called me to attend her just now. Is it serious? Miss Marple inquired. Nervous exhaustion, primarily. The strain of recent events, coupled with this new investigation. Dr. Haydock looked troubled. She became quite distraught when Sir William told her about the journal and the Saxon crown. Kept insisting that some secrets should remain buried. Miss Marple's expression sharpened with interest. Those exact words? Yes. Curious phrasing. I thought? After leaving the church, Miss Marple made a decision. Instead of returning directly home, she took the path toward Ludgrove Hall. Her official reason, should anyone ask, would be to inquire after Lady Penelope's health. Her actual purpose was considerably more investigative. The grand house appeared quiet as she approached. A maid answered her knock, informing her that Sir William was still at the police station, and Lady Penelope was resting under doctor's orders. I won't disturb her, Miss Marple assured the young woman. But perhaps I might leave a small token. Some flowers from my garden for her bedside table? The maid hesitated, then nodded. I can take them up, ma'am. How kind. Might I arrange them? Properly first. I find a vase in the drawing room would be ideal. Once admitted to the drawing room, Miss Marple took her time arranging the flowers, her observant eyes taking in details of the elegant space. The Ludgrove family portraits lined one wall, stern Victorian ancestors giving way to more recent generations. Her attention was caught by a modern photograph showing Lady Penelope in academic robes, receiving what appeared to be a degree or award. Moving closer, she read the inscription, Penelope Harkins, First Class Honors in Conservation. Studies, University of London. Harkins, Lady Penelope's maiden name. Something stirred in Miss Marple's memory. Her subtle investigation was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of Lady Penelope herself. Wrapped in a dressing gown and looking pale but composed. Miss Marple, she said quietly. Sarah mentioned you were here. How kind of you to bring flowers. I hope I haven't disturbed your rest, Lady Ludgrove. Dr. Haydock mentioned you were unwell, just overwhelmed by recent events. Lady Penelope moved to a chair, gesturing for Miss Marple to join her. "This business with Edward Ludgrove's journal. It's opened wounds that have barely begun to heal. Family secrets can be burdensome," Miss Marple observed gently, "particularly when they span generations." "You have no idea," Lady Penelope sighed. "William's family has been bound by Reginald Ludgrove's oath for over a century, protecting artifacts that rightfully belong to the nation, living in fear of discovery. And now the crown may finally be found," Miss Marple suggested. Lady Penelope's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her dressing gown. "If it exists." "You doubt it does?" "I've seen no proof beyond Edward's embittered claims. He was, by all accounts, jealous of his brother's position." Miss Marple studied the younger woman thoughtfully. "Forgive me, but I noticed your graduation. Photograph. Conservation studies. Quite an accomplishment." "Ancient history now," Lady Penelope replied, with a dismissive wave. "Before I married William, at the University of London, I couldn't help wondering if your path might have crossed with Professor Hargrove's during your studies. He lectured there, I believe, before his appointment at Cambridge." The subtle shift in Lady Penelope's expression would have been imperceptible to most observers, but Miss Marple didn't miss the momentary tightening around her eyes. "Briefly," she acknowledged, "academic circles can be quite small." "Indeed. And Miss Palmer's as well, perhaps?" Lady Penelope rose abruptly. "I'm feeling rather tired after all, Miss Marple. Perhaps we could continue this conversation another time." Miss Marple also stood, smiling apologetically. "Of course. How thoughtless of me to tire you with questions. Before I go, might I use your powder room?" Directed to a small bathroom off the main hall, Miss Marple took the opportunity to glance into the adjacent study, where Sir William's desk was covered with papers related to the new investigation. Among them, she noticed a genealogical chart of the Ludgrove family that appeared to have been recently consulted. Returning home, Miss Marple found James Porter waiting at her gate. "Mr. Porter," she greeted him, "I thought you'd return to London." "Changed my plans when I heard about the Saxon crown," he admitted. "Too good a story to walk away from." "Journalistic instinct again?" "Something like that." Porter glanced around before continuing in a lower voice. "I've been doing some research on Lady Penelope Ludgrove. Before her marriage, she specialized in metal conservation techniques at the same university where Hargrove taught. More interestingly, her maternal grandmother's maiden name was Ludgrove, a distant cousin of Sir William's family branch." Miss Marple's eyes widened slightly. "How very interesting. It gets better. 5 years ago, just before the discovery of the Ludgrove dagger, she was working in Professor Hargrove's laboratory as a research assistant. Her name appears in his acknowledgments on 3 papers about Saxon metalwork. A connection she failed to mention during the investigation," Miss Marple noted. "Exactly. And here's the clincher. Vivian Palmer was her roommate during graduate school." As Porter left to continue his investigation, Miss Marple sat in her garden, connecting these new pieces of information with the puzzle that had been troubling her. Lady Penelope's art restoration background, her connection to both Professor Hargrove and Miss Palmer, her reaction to the news about the Saxon crown, her family's distant relationship to the Ludgroves, which had culminated in marriage to Sir William himself, and most significantly, her presence at the garden party on the day Dr. Jennings was discovered murdered. Miss Marple recalled her conversation with Inspector Slack about who had been seen walking near the gardener's shed. Lady Penelope had been one of the first names she'd mentioned. As dusk fell, another piece of the puzzle clicked into place. The silent witness Edward Ludgrove mentioned wasn't just the original dagger. It was something else he had left behind. Something that would reveal the crown's guardian. Miss Marple reached for her telephone and dialed the vicarage. When Tahiti, Florence Dane answered, she asked a single question. The Ludgrove family crypt, where the original dagger was found. Are there any inscriptions or unusual markings on Edward Ludgrove's portion of the tomb? As a matter of fact, yes, Florence replied, sounding surprised. There's a small brass plaque with an odd Latin phrase, Corona sub corona mane. The crown remains under the crown. We assumed it was some sort of religious reference. Or a literal clue, Miss Marple suggested. Is there anything in the church or churchyard that might be considered a crown? There was a moment of silence before Florence gasped. The old yew tree, the one on the north side of the churchyard. It's been shaped for centuries to resemble a crown. The Ludgrove tomb is directly beneath it. I believe, Miss Marple said quietly, that we need to inform Inspector Slack immediately. And perhaps we should also warn him that the crown may already have a new guardian who is determined to keep it hidden. Chapter 12. The final revelation dawn was just breaking over St. Mary Mead as a small group gathered in the churchyard. Inspector Slack had assembled a discreet team, including 2 constables and an archaeological expert hastily summoned from London. Miss Marple stood beside the vicar and Florence Dane, watching as the ground beneath the ancient yew tree was carefully examined. The roots make excavation challenging, the archaeologist explained, studying the area with experienced eyes. But there are signs of previous disturbance. Relatively recent, I'd say. How recent? Slack demanded. Within the last few months. Someone has been digging here. Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her eyes were alert with interest. Just as I suspected, she murmured to Dr. Haydock, who had joined them. At her request, Dr. Jennings found Edward Ludgrove's clue and located the crown. And was killed for his discovery, Dr. Haydock added grimly. The excavation proceeded with painstaking care. By mid-morning, the constables had uncovered a small metal box, similar to the one Dr. Jennings had kept in the gardener's shed, but considerably older and bearing the Ludgrove family crest. Empty, Slack announced after carefully opening it, but recently disturbed. Inside the box was a depression in the shape of a small circlet, lined with faded velvet. A scrap of paper bore a single word in Dr. Jennings's handwriting. Confirmed. The crown was here, Miss Marple said quietly. Dr. Jennings found it, documented his discovery, and then she was interrupted by the arrival of Sir William and Lady Penelope. Sir William looked ashen, while Lady Penelope's composed demeanor seemed brittle, her eyes darting nervously between the excavation site and Miss Marple. What is the meaning of this? Sir William demanded. Digging up the churchyard without proper authorization. We have authorization, Sir William, Slack replied crisply. And evidence that the Saxon crown mentioned in your ancestors' journal was hidden here, beneath the yew tree. Was being the operative word, Miss Marple added gently. It appears someone has removed it quite recently. Lady Penelope stepped forward, her voice surprisingly steady. This is absurd. Even if such a crown existed, it would be Ludgrove family property. Not necessarily, the archaeologist interjected. An artifact of such historical significance would be subject to treasure trove laws. Miss Marple's gaze remained fixed on Lady Penelope. You knew about the crown long before Edward Ludgrove's journal was discovered, didn't you? It was the real reason you cultivated a relationship with Sir William, to gain access to the Ludgrove family secrets. Sir William turned to his wife, in confusion. Penelope? Your wife has a remarkable background, Sir William, Miss Marple continued. Conservation studies at the same university where Professor Hargrove taught. A distant family connection to the Ludgroves through her maternal grandmother. And a specialization in Saxon metalwork that would prove invaluable in creating a convincing replica of the Ludgrove dagger. Lady Penelope's composed facade began to crack. You can't prove any of this. Perhaps not directly, Miss Marple acknowledged, but when Mr. Porter discovered your previous connection to both Professor Hargrove and Miss Palmer, a connection you deliberately concealed during the murder investigation, it became clear that your role in this affair was far more significant than you claimed. Inspector Slack stepped forward. Lady Ludgrove, I must ask you to account for your whereabouts on the morning Dr. Jennings was killed. I was at home, preparing for the garden party. The staff can confirm it. And the morning Mr. Porter was attacked near the burial mounds? A flicker of uncertainty crossed Lady Penelope's face. I was in the village, shopping. No, Miss Marple corrected gently. You were observed near the church by Mr. Elmsley, the gardener, who was trimming the hedges. You were carrying a small spade, which he found curious for a lady of your position. Sir William stared at his wife in growing horror. Penelope, what have you done? Lady Penelope's composure finally shattered. What I had to do. The crown was my family's legacy as much as yours, William. My grandmother told me stories about it. How Reginald Ludgrove stole it from his brother. How our branch of the family was cheated of its rightful inheritance. So you orchestrated the entire scheme, Miss Marple said. You introduced Professor Hargrove to Sir William, knowing his academic ambition would make him the perfect accomplice in discovering a replica of the dagger. You used your expertise to help create the forgery, while secretly searching for the crown itself. It was mine by right, Lady Penelope insisted, her voice rising. When that interfering archaeologist found it, you killed him, Slack finished flatly. He would have ruined everything. Years of planning, of careful research. I knew the crown must be hidden somewhere on the Ludgrove property. When Edward's clue finally led me to the churchyard, I discovered Jennings had found it first. Her face contorted with anger. He had no right, no understanding of what it meant. So you took the archaeological mallet from Professor Hargrove's collection and struck Dr. Jennings from behind, Miss Marple said. Then you hid his body in the gardener's shed, knowing it would eventually be found. And when Porter came too close to finding Jennings's evidence at the burial mound, you attacked him as well, Slack added. Lady Penelope's eyes darted toward the church door. In a sudden movement, she turned and ran, her heels clicking on the stone path. The constables moved to pursue her, but Miss Marple called out, "The crypt! She's going for the crown!" Inside the church, they found Lady Penelope kneeling before the Ludgrove tomb, frantically trying to open a small concealed panel that had been revealed when the original dagger was discovered. "It's too late," Slack said, gesturing for the constables, "to take her into custody. Your accomplices have confessed. The game is over, Lady Ludgrove." As Lady Penelope was led away, her final words echoed in the ancient church. It should have remained buried. Some treasures demand too high a price. The panel she had been attempting to open yielded to the archaeologist's careful touch, revealing a small hollow. Within it lay a breathtaking artifact, a delicate Saxon crown of gold and silver, set with amber and garnets, remarkably preserved after centuries of concealment. "Extraordinary," the archaeologist breathed. "Perhaps the most significant Saxon find in decades." "The true silent witness," Miss Marple observed, "hidden first by Reginald Ludgrove, then by Dr. Jennings, who recognized its importance, and finally, by Lady Penelope after she murdered him to possess it. Later that afternoon, as the crown was being carefully prepared for transport to the British Museum, Miss Marple sat with the Bantrys and Dr. Haydock in her garden. "I still can't believe it," Mrs. Bantry said, shaking her head. "To think, Lady Penelope was behind everything. The forgery, Dr. Jennings's murder, even the attack on Mr. Porter." "Not entirely behind everything," Miss Marple corrected. "Professor Hargrove and Miss Palmer were willing accomplices in the archaeological fraud. But Lady Penelope had her own agenda from the beginning, finding the Saxon crown that she believed was her family's rightful inheritance. And she used them all," Colonel Bantry noted. "Her husband, the professor, even the unfortunate Dr. Jennings." "Human nature can be disturbingly consistent," Miss Marple sighed. "The desire for recognition, for possession of beautiful things, for righting perceived historical wrongs. These motives appear again and again throughout history." "At least justice has been served," Dr. Haydock observed, "and the crown will now be properly preserved for the nation." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, her knitting needles moving rhythmically as she gazed across her peaceful garden. "Though I can't help but wonder if Edward Ludgrove would be satisfied with this outcome. His silent witness finally spoke the truth after all these years, but at such a terrible cost." Inspector Slack stepped forward. "Lady Ludgrove, I must ask you to account for your whereabouts on the morning Dr. Jennings was killed." "I was at home, preparing for the garden party. The staff can confirm it. And the morning Mr. Porter was attacked near the burial mounds?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Lady Penelope's face. I was in the village, shopping." "No," Miss Marple corrected gently. "You were observed near the church by Mr. Elmsley, the gardener, who was trimming the hedges. You were carrying a small spade, which he found curious for a lady of your position." Sir William stared at his wife in growing horror. "Penelope, what have you done?" Lady Penelope's composure finally shattered. "What I had to do. The crown was my family's legacy as much as yours, William. My grandmother told me stories about it. How Reginald Ludgrove stole it from his brother. How our branch of the family was cheated of its rightful inheritance." "So you orchestrated the entire scheme," Miss Marple said. "You introduced Professor Hargrove to Sir William, knowing his academic ambition would make him the perfect accomplice in discovering a replica of the dagger. You used your expertise to help create the forgery, while secretly searching for the crown itself." "It was mine by right," Lady Penelope insisted, her voice rising. "When that interfering archaeologist found it—" "You killed him," Slack finished flatly. "He would have ruined everything. Years of planning, of careful research. I knew the crown must be hidden somewhere on the Ludgrove property. When Edward's clue finally led me to the churchyard, I discovered Jennings had found it first." Her face contorted with anger. "He had no right, no understanding of what it meant. So you took the archaeological mallet from Professor Hargrove's collection and struck Dr. Jennings from behind," Miss Marple said. "Then you hid his body in the gardener's shed, knowing it would eventually be found. And when Porter came too close to finding Jennings's evidence at the burial mound, you attacked him as well," Slack added. Lady Penelope's eyes darted toward the church door. In a sudden movement, she turned and ran, her heels clicking on the stone path. The constables moved to pursue her, but Miss Marple called out, "The crypt! She's going for the crown!" Inside the church, they found Lady Penelope kneeling before the Ludgrove tomb, frantically trying to open a small concealed panel that had been revealed when the original dagger was discovered. "It's too late," Slack said, gesturing for the constables. to take her into custody. Your accomplices have confessed. The game is over, Lady Ludgrove. As Lady Penelope was led away, her final words echoed in the ancient church. It should have remained buried. Some treasures demand too high a price. The panel she had been attempting to open yielded to the archaeologist's careful touch, revealing a small hollow. Within it lay a breathtaking artifact, a delicate Saxon crown of gold and silver, set with amber and garnets, remarkably preserved after centuries of concealment. Extraordinary, the archaeologist breathed. Perhaps the most significant Saxon find in decades. The true silent witness, Miss Marple observed, hidden first by Reginald Ludgrove, then by Dr. Jennings, who recognized its importance, and finally by Lady Penelope after she murdered him to possess it. Later that afternoon, as the crown was being carefully prepared for transport to the British Museum, Miss Marple sat with the Bantrys and Dr. Haydock in her garden. "I still can't believe it," Mrs. Bantry said, shaking her head. "To think, Lady, Penelope was behind everything. The forgery, Dr. Jennings's murder, even the attack on Mr. Porter." "Not entirely behind everything," Miss Marple corrected. "Professor Hargrove and Miss Palmer were willing accomplices in the archaeological fraud. But Lady Penelope had her own agenda from the beginning, finding the Saxon crown that she believed was her family's rightful inheritance. And she used them all," Colonel Bantry noted. "Her husband, the professor, even the unfortunate Dr. Jennings." "Human nature can be disturbingly consistent," Miss Marple sighed. "The desire for recognition, for possession of beautiful things, for righting perceived historical wrongs, these motives appear again and again throughout history." "At least justice has been served," Dr. Haydock observed, "and the crown will now be properly preserved for the nation." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed, her knitting needles moving rhythmically as she gazed across her peaceful garden. "Though I can't help but wonder if Edward Ludgrove would be satisfied with this outcome. His silent witness finally spoke the truth after all these years, but at such a terrible cost."